Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm Mark Rozelle, Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to our conversation with Andrew McCabe, former Deputy Director of the FBI, and now a distinguished visiting professor at the Schar School at George Mason University. Mr. McCabe is affiliated with our Center for Security Policy Studies and will begin teaching in the spring semester for us. He will join a wonderful group of former senior government practitioners and leaders who inspire our students and make them better prepared to join the federal workforce or other policy-related institutions. Today's event is co-hosted by the Center for Security Policy Studies and the Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. This conversation will be moderated by Michael Morell, former two-time acting director of the CIA and a distinguished senior fellow with the Hayden Center, and also Professor Ellen Laipson, who directs our International Security Studies program and our Center for Security Policy Studies. And Michael and Ellen assure me on behalf of Mr. McCabe that this won't be as tough as an FBI interrogation. So I would like to turn this over now to my colleague, Professor Ellen Laipson. Ellen?
Thank you so much, Dean Rozelle. And I want to just add my warm welcome to Andrew McCabe. It's a wonderful addition to the Schar School team. And I know the students have already benefited from having a chance to interact with you. So welcome. We'll be calling you Professor McCabe very soon. So we're off to a good start. So really, and Michael and I are going to take turns posing questions to you, and there'll be plenty of time for questions from our participants who will be encouraged to put their questions in either Q&A or the chat box, okay? So that's housekeeping. So there's so much to talk about. The FBI is in the news every day for various both controversies and achievements, et cetera. And we really want to hear about your personal story, but I thought it might be best to start with some foundational information from you, if you could. So I wanted to ask you to just tell us the essentials of how does the FBI see its mission, what has its mission been historically, but also the major change that occurred after 9/11. How did the FBI adapt to such a dramatic and disruptive change in US national security?
Sure, and thank you so much, Ellen and Mark and Michael, for putting this together. It's a thrill to be able to speak to folks, even if it's from my basement, and it's such a privilege to be associated with the Schar School. So I'm really looking forward to this relationship that we're all just starting. So the FBI is, as you know, it's far more than just a law enforcement and intelligence organization. It is an aspect of American life. It's an icon in the American experience. It's over 100 years old. It's currently composes of about 37,000 people who serve predominantly in the United States, but in fact in embassies around the globe. We have 56 field offices, and I'll pardon my use of the term we. I consistently still in my head associate myself with the Bureau. I don't think I'll ever stop doing that, but there are 56 field offices around the country and about another 400 facilities when you think of sub-offices and specialized facilities and covert locations and things like that. So it's a lot of people, it's a lot of stuff, and that's appropriate for an organization with a mission as broad as the FBI. The FBI's mission statement is very simple. It is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. And FBI folks do that primarily in two ways. The FBI, as we all know, in light of the developments and conversations and controversy after September 11th, the FBI is kind of a two-sided animal, right? We have our traditional criminal side, in which we have the authority to investigate violations of essentially all federal criminal law. So that's everything from narcotics and extortions and white-collar crimes and crimes on Indian reservations and crimes against children and every part of the federal criminal code that you can possibly think of. All that work falls within the FBI's traditional criminal investigative role. But the FBI is also a national security organization. We have always had primary responsibility to conduct intelligence investigations here in the United States. It's a very sensitive and careful side of our mission because of the sensitivity that Americans rightly have with the idea of an intelligence agency investigating them here in the States. So we're subjected to a whole host of rules and regulations and laws, all of those, of course, stemming from the Constitution, about how we are supposed to interact with what we call USPers, U.S. persons. So that's American citizens and anyone who is here in this country legally. So people who are on valid, immigration status in the country, and also American citizens abroad, wherever they might interact and find themselves. So we are the USPer organization. We're the organization of the federal government that has the responsibility of handling the communications and the investigations of American citizens. So that comes with it a lot of a very specific regulation and controls. Within the national security side, the FBI conducts investigations of counterintelligence issues, which is, of course, the traditional work of countering the work of foreign intelligence agents and assets here in the United States as they try to uncover and steal our classified information, our national security information, our private sector information, all those sorts of things that foreign nations do to try to benefit their own lot in the world. And of course, a counterterrorism mission. So it's our responsibility to prevent an act of terror here in the United States or against Americans anywhere. So it's those three very, very broad, very important areas: our criminal work, our counterintelligence work, and our counterterrorism work that really keeps the Bureau busy these days. We have, in the last few decades, added a very vibrant cyber division and a cyber focus to our work. Quite frankly, I think we've struggled, as many agencies have, to decide for ourselves whether cyber is an entity and a line of business in and of itself, or if it's merely a facility that is taken advantage of and used in our other three lines of business. I think the answer to that question is probably yes on both sides, right? So we've found that all of our work on the criminal side, in counterterrorism and in counterintelligence, has become infinitely more imbued with cyber challenges as cyber has taken over how people communicate and interact. But there is also still a very specific technologically advanced discipline of cyber investigation. So we need some really great cyber people to do that undeniable cyber work of keeping track of our adversaries in cyberspace, utilizing tools like FISA authority to enable not just the FBI, but the entire intelligence community to benefit from that unique authority to go to the FISA court and get authorization to conduct electronic surveillance. So that's very broadly what the FBI does and kind of the main areas that we're focused on today.
Just a quick follow-up. After 9/11, I thought there were some big decisions had to be made about not only, the forensics on how did 9/11 happen and where did things fall through the cracks, but that structurally the FBI sort of rethought how you're going to balance the allocation of resources and how you train people, et cetera. Could you just say a few words about that?
Sure. I think the nation's experience on 9/11 certainly uncovered the fact that the Bureau had not really developed its intelligence side in the way that the world now requires us to function. And so that gets to some of those issues that you talked about information falling through the cracks. We were specifically kind of, tying one hand behind our own back in a lot of the work that we were doing, particularly on the terrorism side, because we were still operating under really unfavorable kind of legal and policy requirements where our intelligence agents were not allowed to talk to our agents who were conducting investigations that might result in criminal prosecution. There was the infamous wall between the intelligence and the criminal side. And so that was hampering us in a lot of ways, in both internally and in dealing with our intelligence partners. And I think it was one of the reasons why we'd really not stepped up to our role in the intelligence community. So some of those failures provoked lots of folks to think that, well, maybe we need to split the intelligence function out of the FBI, let the Bureau continue to do its criminal work, and develop a new domestic intelligence agency in the United States along the British model, where you have MI5, which conducts domestic intelligence matters, and MI6 is focused on, of course, external intelligence matters. Our director at the time, Robert Mueller, was very strongly opposed to that, dividing the FBI in that way. And he ultimately prevailed in his vigorous kind of campaign on the Hill and with the White House to hold back the tide. And the reason was that while we had failed in some respects in our intelligence mission, those things could be fixed. We could rebuild our intelligence capacity and essentially get it to where we needed to be. And by keeping that in the FBI, we took advantage of unique strengths that there are in having one agency have both an intelligence and a criminal investigative function. So we spent a lot of time talking to our colleagues in the UK, and Canada, and other places that have a more of a bifurcated system. And almost all of them would say, we wish we had the powers, the ability to combine those missions in the way that the FBI does. You get a unique flexibility and a unique access to legal authorities and tools, having to wear those two hats at the same time. And so we felt like we were better off taking advantage of that strength than tearing everything apart, to try to answer that question.
Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Let me just add my warm welcome to Andy. It is great to have you at George Mason and the Schar School. So congratulations and welcome.
Thank you.
What I'd love to do, Andy, is dig a little bit more into this counterintelligence thing. But before we do that, I'd love to just get your reaction to what the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, has done over the last week. So last week, he actually released some intelligence showing that the Russians at least thought the Clinton campaign was talking about ways of highlighting the possible relationship between the Russians and Donald Trump. And just yesterday, he released some notes that John Brennan, some personal notes that John Brennan had made when John briefed the president on that intelligence, and also a memo from CIA to the FBI. And I just wanted to get your reaction to the release of all that information.
It's we really have beaten the hell out of the word extraordinary and unprecedented. I mean, it seems like every day we have, you can point to examples where different elements of the administration are doing things that just shatter norms and are complete contrast to, the ways that we've done business for a long time. Certainly this is one of them. The idea that you would selectively release highly classified intelligence in the middle of a hotly contested political campaign for really no apparent reason other than having an impact on the political fight. I don't think it had ever occurred to me that I would ever see any director of national intelligence in this country take those sort of steps. But I suppose when you put it in the overall perspective of all the other unprecedented and damaging things we've seen in the last few years, we should probably have, or I should probably have expected it. As far as that specific intelligence goes, I haven't seen the documents that were released yesterday, but the ones that came out last week about the Russian, supposed alleged Russian intelligence about Clinton campaign plans. That's not something I remember even hearing about in 2016 when these events were taking place. It seemed to me last week, it's exactly the kind of thing that you kind of expect to hear from Russia in terms of misinformation and active measures, disinformation, and the fact that even the DNI's own release referred to it as, completely unverified allegations is just, it's not, I don't even know how to characterize it. It's so bizarre and so seemingly political. It's just a really concerning weaponization of classified intelligence, taking it out of the natural analytical process of vetting and trying to understand how these pieces fit into our understanding of what the adversary is doing, and just kind of plucking one thing out of that massive pile of information and communications and kind of things that our analysts digest every day. Just really, really concerning and I think destructive to the mission of the intelligence community.
Thanks. So Andy, let me ask you a little bit more about a counterintelligence investigation. And, one, how is it different from a criminal investigation? What are the standards to open up a counterintelligence investigation? Are they the same as for a criminal investigation? Obviously, in a counterintelligence investigation, you're looking at both foreigners and potentially U.S. persons. So are they handled any differently? Could you just talk a little bit about all of that?
Sure. So the standards that the FBI has, the kind of threshold level of information we have to open a case, which we refer to as predication, are very similar. They come to us through the same document. It's the Domestic Investigations Operations Guideline. We call it the DIOG. It's essentially, the Attorney General guidelines are given from the Attorney General to the FBI. They lay out our authorities and how we're supposed to conduct our business. And then the FBI writes the DIOG as a more of a nuts and bolts way of like, here's how we exercise those authorities and live up to those obligations. It's very specific about investigative techniques and what sort of investigative techniques and tools you can use in different investigations. It's fascinating document. If you're really into that stuff, it's publicly available on the internet. So it's, it's redacted in places, but you can see it for yourself. And essentially the standard for opening what we call a full field investigation, so that's our most robust, expansive investigation, is when we have information that tends to indicate that a federal crime has been committed or that a threat to national security exists. So if you have information that indicates a federal crime may have been committed, then you open a criminal case. If you have information that indicates a threat to national security might exist, you would open a counterintelligence case, or if it's a terrorist issue, a terrorism case. So it's really very simple. It's a very low standard. People have questioned whether it should be a higher standard of proof before you can initiate an investigation. I would advocate strenuously against that. I think it's an appropriately low standard, because we have to remember that what you are doing at that moment is initiating an investigation simply to figure out if the predication you have is accurate or not. Nobody goes to jail because you've opened a case. You're not prosecuted simply because an investigation was opened. It's a very serious thing, but it enables the FBI to then say, okay, we have an investigation open. Now we can use the following tools or techniques to understand whether this predication is valid. So on the foreign counterintelligence side, it is essential that that work is done very, very quietly. I know that's kind of crazy in the current day and age when it seems like we're talking about foreign counterintelligence all the time. But you have to be able to vet the information you have, the predication you have, without letting the subject know or letting the world know that you are investigating a person in that way, because it can be incredibly damaging to their reputation and careers and all sorts of things like that. So counterintelligence cases are classified for that reason. Because they are classified, you have access to classified tools like electronic surveillance that's conducted under the FISA law, so court authorized electronic surveillance under FISA. And the idea is at the end of your investigation, you will come to a point in your investigation where you've either decided, no, the initial predication was not correct, and there is actually no national security threat here, in which case you close the case and walk away, and no one is harmed by the fact that that investigation took place. The United States has been protected. Or you determine that there is, in fact, a national security threat here, and you continue to investigate. At that point, you might investigate for many, many years because it becomes a beneficial collection point of intelligence. You might be collecting like vital intelligence about the operations of our foreign adversary. Or you might find that the subject of that case has in fact violated the criminal laws of this country by passing classified information to the foreign adversary. That would put them running afoul of the Espionage Act. And so sometimes counterintelligence cases are resolved with criminal charges, but in the vast majority of times they are not. They become intelligence collection opportunities, or they're simply closed because there's no threat present.
Could you put, Andy, the Crossfire Hurricane investigation, this is the investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election, within the context of what you just said? Why did you guys, to the extent you can talk about it, right?
Sure.
Why did you guys start it? And, was there any doubt in your mind that it met the standard required to open up an investigation? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So what we knew about Russian interference in the election at that point was very important. It's hard, I think, in a lot of the conversation around this issue, people have lost sight of the context within which we then received information that caused us great concern. So we knew that the Russians had been targeting all kinds of different institutions, American institutions, in cyberspace as early as the fall of 2014. The Russians embarked on a particularly active, aggressive campaign of probing the computer networks of academic institutions, think tanks, some government institutions, political institutions. We would see this activity through our surveillance capabilities, that they would probe these systems and essentially, in some cases, we're actually able to infiltrate systems and exfiltrate data. We didn't know what they were doing with the information they were taking. I think probably the most kind of common assessment of that was they were conducting the normal sort of intelligence collection that adversaries do all the time. And that's what our adversaries do. They want to understand what we're thinking, what we're doing, what we're planning, those sorts of things. And so that activity continued to build throughout 2015. Then in the early spring of 2016, we saw other Russian intelligence actors get involved in that same activity, and we saw them start to target the Democratic National Committee. We saw them not just target the DNC, but actually enter the DNC systems and begin to exfiltrate a lot of data. Again, the question was, what are they going to do with all this data? Well, eventually we all found out. That data was released through different kind of online, personas, persona well known as Guccifer 2.0, and then of course, ultimately released with the assistance of WikiLeaks right on the eve of the Democratic National Convention in 2016. So just as then candidate Hillary Clinton was prepared to receive the nomination, it appeared that the Russians released this information with the specific intent of damaging her candidacy. That was, it's a weaponization of stolen cyber material that we had not seen before, which really caused everybody great pause. And there was no question at that point that the Russians were playing a very active role in our presidential campaign. But shortly after that release, we were contacted by a diplomat from a friendly foreign nation, a nation that we typically exchange intelligence with. And that diplomat told our folks overseas of a conversation he had had with George Papadopoulos months before the release of the DNC information. So in early May or mid-May, the diplomat had met with Papadopoulos in a kind of a social, having a drink at a bar sort of thing. And Papadopoulos said infamously to him that the campaign had been offered assistance by Russia, and the assistance they offered, they said they had a lot of negative information about Hillary Clinton that they would share with the campaign in order to damage Clinton. So now we knew what the Russians were doing for a long time. We knew what they had done with the weaponization of this material, but all of a sudden now we had a member of the campaign, George Papadopoulos, who appeared to have advanced knowledge that this was going to take place and might be indicating that the campaign was actually coordinating with the Russian government, which is both a violation of election law and an enormously serious thing, an enormous, of course, intelligence threat, national security threat to the nation. So it is with that information and that information only that we open the Crossfire Hurricane case. There's been a lot said about the information we ultimately received from Christopher Steele. We had not, in fact, received that information at FBI headquarters at the time we opened the Crossfire Hurricane case, so we didn't know anything about it. So it was not a factor in the opening of the case. Once we decided to open a case to understand if anyone from the Trump campaign had actually coordinated with the Russians, the first question becomes, okay, what individuals are you going to investigate to figure out if that's happened? And so we looked closely at those people who we knew were publicly associated with the campaign, and we came up with a list of 4 folks who had had interactions with Russia in the past who might then be serving as this coordination point. It's really a very simple analysis. And of course, those 4 were Carter Page, who was already the subject of a foreign counterintelligence investigation based on his prior interaction with Russian intelligence officers in New York. George Papadopoulos, because he's the guy that made the comment about working with the Russians on negative information. Paul Manafort, who is already under investigation for his suspicious and likely criminal interactions with high-level Ukrainian officials who were supported by the Russian government. And finally, General Michael Flynn. And General Flynn had a series of, he'd had some travel to Russia in the past in which he'd interacted with high-level Russian officials to include President Putin. And so that's how we came up with that first list of 4 investigations.
And no doubt in your mind, Andy, that this met the standard. I mean, it sounds certainly like it met the standard.
I mean, it wasn't even a question. It absolutely, not only did it meet the standard, we all felt very strongly that under the circumstances, we were obligated to open the investigation. This is not the sort of threat that you can turn away from or decide, oh, we'll do it some other time. It was an ongoing active measures campaign by the Russians targeting our democracy. And if they were doing it in league with a candidate for the presidency, then that was something that we had to take very seriously.
Great. Back to Ellen.
Thank you. So Andy, I'd like to now zoom in. I know behind your shoulder is your book, The Threat, which I thoroughly enjoyed reading. You managed to be a New York Times and Washington Post bestseller just within a very short time of leaving government. But the book is very, compelling and dramatic about the troubles you experienced and the enormous political pressure that was put on you and other FBI leaders that led you to, leave the institution and perhaps with a sense of sadness or bitterness after a long and successful career. So I'm going to blend in a few of the questions that we're getting from the audience about how do you navigate, both in that last year, which I'm sure was a painful experience for you and your family, but even the decisions about writing the book and what goes in the book and what doesn't go in the book, and how much to share. So these tensions between trying to avoid politicization, desire for transparency, trying to be fair. We have several questions in from our audience about how do young people who might be interested in entering this career field, how do they navigate and avoid getting politically labeled or running into trouble? So anything in that vast array of topics that you can share with us would be great.
Sure, I'd be, there's a lot to chew on there. So, I guess to say just one thing about the work, right? To put everything else aside, the work in those last 2 years, from the beginning of 2016 until I left in the beginning of 2018, was just unbelievably challenging. I mean, right from the Clinton, the Clinton email investigation, which we refer to as the mid-year exam, and into Crossfire Hurricane, we found ourselves in a political firestorm. And we made a number of decisions which were controversial and impactful. And some decisions that I look back on today and I look at very differently than I did then. I think some decisions we could have made, we could have made better. But regardless of that fact, the work itself was incredibly challenging. You don't learn at Quantico how to investigate a candidate who's running for president. That's not it's not thought of. It's not a common part of our work. I don't think we'd ever done it before, and I'm sure everyone in the FBI hopes we never have to do it again. So that was challenging enough. But to layer on top of those work challenges, things like being attacked by one of the candidates, Donald Trump, from his political rallies in October of 2016, to really what continues to this day, it added a level of pressure and kind of surreal torment to what was already a very challenging period of time. But what we tried to do, certainly what I tried to do, is what FBI people do every day under enormously challenging circumstances. And that is to focus on the work and your duty to do that work as vigorously and aggressively and fairly as you possibly can, and according to, consistent with the Constitution and the legal authorities that you have to get it done. You will not do it perfectly, but if you apply yourself to it 110%, 7 days a week, then that's the most that anyone can ask of you. So that's kind of how I approached it. I think that's the way FBI people get through tough times all the time. I'm sure it's probably very similar in other agencies. Mike, I'm sure you have your own very powerful experiences with that as well. Leaving the organization was excruciating. It still is on some level. I absolutely love the FBI. I think about FBI people every day and the work that they're doing and the conditions under which they do it now, which are also unique and challenging. And so to be separated in the way that I was incredibly frustrating, and it was sad, and it left me really in a tough spot in 2018. And that's when the idea of writing the book came to me. I really didn't have any idea how I would get through it, but I knew that I needed something to focus on at that time, and a way to think about my FBI experience in a more organized and disciplined way, rather than just kind of stomping around the house, getting mad about stuff and giving speeches to my dog. So it was a tough thing to do, but I think it was really good for me at the time, because it kind of forced me to step back from the crazy and damaging events of the previous year and a half, 2 years, and to think more holistically about what it is I love about the organization and why I was drawn to it, and what I learned along the way that kind of enabled me to make some of those very, very hard decisions in the last 2 years. So as I've been fortunate to go out and talk about the book and speak to different audiences, it's really important to me to kind of explain to people how incredible it is to work for an organization like the FBI or like the CIA or NSA or any of our intelligence community entities. And I'm willing to admit that I am probably the worst recruiter. I'm like the worst example of a federal government career at this point, having been, so notoriously removed in the way that I was. But I like to turn that around and and suggest, like, despite all that, I would still sit here and tell your students and your friends and your colleagues that it is the greatest work on earth, and it's the greatest experience you can have as an American, as a patriot, as someone who's interested in your community and your country and the principles that we all agree to, all of us across the spectrum. The idea of protecting this nation and its people in a way that's consistent with our values and our Constitution, and ensuring that people who are victimized get justice, and that that's done fairly according to a process we all understand. It's just there, I could go on and on all day. It's the greatest honor and privilege to be able to fill a role like that in this nation. So despite all the craziness that people have seen happening in and around the FBI in the last few years, I still tell people every day, if you think you're up to that challenge, it is worth it. It is the greatest adventure you'll have in your life. You'll get to work with the most wonderful people on earth, and you'll see and do things that the rest of the world only sees in the movies. So it's super fun. It's unbelievably enriching and satisfying. So it's a great thing to do, despite the fact that I got fired.
So thanks. But even the question of what went in the book and what didn't go in the book. So between your editors, I can imagine there was pressure to, tell us more of, really, the dirty inside secrets, et cetera. How did you balance a desire to have a coherent, patriotic story told with the pressure to sensationalize and turn it into a celebrity story, but also what was the review process like? How did people who were still in the FBI clear your book when it had some strong, political judgments in it? So I still think it's a tricky area for people who have federal work experience, do want to share with the rest of the world what that's like. But your whole situation was so heavily politicized. Just, can you say a little bit more on, did you have disagreements with your editors or with the review process about what could stay in and what couldn't stay in the book?
Sure. So not really any major knockdown, drag out fights with my editors. They were pretty happy with what I turned into them. It was a hand-to-hand, full-on combat with the FBI in terms of getting it through pre-publication review, which is a requirement for any FBI employee. It's the same at other institutions that as a result of your clearance and your access to classified information, before you can publish a book, you have to give it to them to read, and they get to say what you have to take out of it. The FBI does their pre-pub review looking for, first and foremost, classified information, which I was very comfortable that I had not put any classified information in the book, but also sensitive information, which is a very murky gray area. I mean, obviously anything from information from a criminal case, it might not be classified, but it's clearly sensitive, especially if it has to do with like evidence that might be used at trial, things like that. So those things are pretty obviously sensitive. But then there are other things, like, for instance, I quoted the DIOG heavily, the manual of our investigative tools that I spoke about earlier. And I got into a real fight with them over whether or not I could do that. And my point was, well, it's online, available to anyone who wants to see it. How could it be considered sensitive? And they felt that, well, the specifics of the DIOG combined with my unique experience and opinions about it made it sensitive. No, that's not true. So we had a number of really robust conversations about what constituted as sensitive information and what constituted my First Amendment right. It's supposed to take 30 days, the process. It took me about 4.5 months and a lot of work. Essentially, the way it works is they do a read through and they send it back to you with all their redactions. And then you have the opportunity to go out and basically argue the redactions. If you can prove to them that what they've asked you to redact has actually been publicly discussed or officially discussed by the department or the FBI, then they'll pull the redaction and let you use that material. So I was able to get back the vast majority of what they'd redacted, or to rewrite it in ways that they were satisfied with. So at the end of the process, which was excruciating, I was still pretty happy with the product that came out of it. A lot of the hang up for me was had to do with the fact that things like my own reflections on my meetings with the president were at that time still considered evidence in the special counsel's investigation. And so I had to be very careful with those things. And the special counsel's office actually got to review the manuscript during the pre-pub process. So that hung some things up and affected the timing a little bit. There were other things that were not yet public. Like, for instance, the fact that we had opened a case against the president himself. It wasn't public, so I talk about it in the book as a hypothetical. Like, for instance, at this point, could we open a case against the president? Well, here's the information we had at that moment. And I lay out the reasons why we did actually open a case. I just didn't say that a case was opened at that time, because you can't reveal the existence of an open investigation. Of course, the special counsel team did reveal that in their report. So all that stuff is now publicly available. It's much easier for me to talk about those things now that the special counsel report is out. So I had to be a little bit careful about those sorts of things and try to kind of find creative ways to write around them. There's a section in the book about a mock counterintelligence investigation, which I made up for the purpose of showing how we layer on our different investigative tools. And how you would start with typically the smallest, kind of lowest profile investigation. And as you develop more information, you seek authority to to work your way up to a full field investigation, and how the investigative tools play into that. They were outraged by it. I said, the facts are completely made up, and it's all based on those parts of the dialogue that are publicly available. So ultimately, I got to keep it in. So it's a bit of a fight, but it's one worth having.
Really interesting. Thank you. Back to Michael.
Yeah, so the way you described, Andy, your career at the FBI is exactly the way I feel about my career at CIA. So that really resonated. Just one more question from me. As you look forward, Andy, to the national security threats that we face today and those that we might face tomorrow, what are the ones that you really think the FBI needs to focus on?
It's really interesting, Mike, and I would expect that our experience over the last 8 months has really affected how you think about threats as well. It's not particularly an FBI responsibility so much, but I think the emergence of the global pandemic and how that's impacted literally the strength, the physical strength, the economic strength of our country, I think has kind of, I think about all those folks in the White House who used to be responsible for pandemic issues, and it was never the first thing. I'm worried about the next bomb going off somewhere in the country, and so worrying about, like, oh my God, the bug that could kill us all might be right around the corner. But now I have to say they were right, and the impact of those sorts of global issues is really something that shakes us to the core. On the FBI side, the FBI's first priority will always be to prevent an act of terrorism. Our most concerning terrorist foes seem to be, and maybe this is just my perspective now out of the game, watching it from the sidelines, but it does seem that our work overseas, and particularly the military's work overseas, has had an incredibly a positive impact on our most concerning terrorist adversaries. They seem to be at a bit of a lower period of activity right now. That's not to say that'll ever go away. It's not the kind of war that you ever win. It's something that needs to be constantly watched. It's given us the space to confront, I think for the first time, the the seriousness of the domestic terror threat here in the United States, as we become more politically divided, as the rhetoric between the sides gets angrier and angrier online and in social media, I think you can expect to see some really, damaging developments on the DT side, particularly with right-wing extremist groups, white supremacist groups. They have always been the big fat part of the curve on our DT work. That's where most of the violent activity has always come from. There are other groups that engage in violence, but the majority of it comes from those who target our Black community, Jewish community, and the kind of the typical white supremacist targets. That is all kind of well and good. That work will go on. I think the challenges of staying ahead on the counterintelligence side just get infinitely worse every day. We become more and more vulnerable to the sort of intelligence collection and now not just intelligence collection operations, but actually aggressive kind of proactive operations in cyberspace that can really impact the nation and our private sector in a terrible way. That race to stay technologically relevant is tighter and tighter every day. And so, keeping track of what our adversaries are doing in cyberspace is, I think, going to stay, that'll be right on the top of the FBI's radar for the next couple of decades.
So Ellen, should we go to some questions?
Yes, indeed. Michael, you and I can both pick a few from the long list. One question is a kind of perhaps a straightforward question. The FISA Court, there's been back and forth post 9/11 about whether it wasn't really a rigorous enough process to decide who can be monitored and who not. Any reflections from your own experience? Do you think the FISA Court is still a functioning system? Is there some changes you would like to make to it?
I think the FISA Court is still a valid and functioning and absolutely necessary piece of our national security architecture. There are a few things that I think they should think about updating. That's really inside baseball. I won't bore you with that. I think that the FBI's processes in preparing FISA applications, I think the work of the Inspector General's report looking at the Carter Page FISAs has exposed some weaknesses in a system that I thought, and I think others like Director Comey and Jim Baker, who was the general counsel in my last 2 years, we all presumed the system was a lot stronger than it actually was because of the layers and layers and layers of oversight. And we've found, unfortunately, with the Page FISAs that there are still opportunities for really fundamental errors that lead ultimately to misleading the court in one way or another, which is not acceptable under any terms. And just to put it, just to kind of put a pin on it, I think what the Page FISAs show us is that despite the fact that there are 13 levels of lawyers that look at the package after it's been produced, if a mistake is made early on in the investigative process, that mistake gets baked in a way that you could have 100 layers of oversight, but those folks can't possibly find it. It is almost impossible, and after the fact, to find what's been left out. On the other hand, the case agents are in an unbelievably tough position. In the FBI, the case agent does everything. They're responsible for every aspect of an investigation, including working with the attorneys to get a FISA package put together. So think about it. If you are a case agent, you are coming across information every day, reams of information about your investigation. You're interviewing witnesses. You might be identifying and recruiting sources. Maybe you're getting intercepts from electronic surveillance. Maybe you're getting intelligence is shared with you from foreign governments or from other intelligence agencies. So you're constantly getting bombarded with information. And in 99% of the cases, what a case agent does is it looks at that information and assesses, does this make my case, how does this make my case stronger? only in FISA, the case agent is also required to think, wait a second, is this information relevant and important to essentially the target's defense? Is this information that bolsters that leans towards the target's innocence? And that's not a decision that agents have to make really in any other context. And if they make that decision incorrectly, like a witness says X when you thought they were going to say Y, and you think, oh, he's just lying or he made a mistake, and you discard that fact rather than kind of marking it as something that needs to be turned over to the court, it's almost impossible to ever find that fact again until someone like the IG comes in and spends 2 years investigating the case file. So the FBI needs to change its process to introduce some sort of rigor that actually includes a ground up review of the case file, the informant information, all that sort of stuff. That can only be done by FBI agents who have access to that sort of classified and ultra sensitive material. So it'd be a hard thing to pull together, but I think it could be done. And I think it would introduce a level of adversarial rigor to that the process currently does not have.
Mm-hmm.
So Andy, I'm gonna put a couple of questions together here, but basically it comes down to what's the appropriate relationship between the FBI and a White House and a National Security Council staff in general, and then in particular with regard to counterintelligence cases?
It's a great question. So the Department of Justice has what they refer to as the Contacts Policy, which is intended to kind of lay down the rules of the road for that relationship between the FBI and the White House. And it basically says that the FBI is not supposed to interact with the White House directly on anything other than national security matters. So on criminal cases, criminal matters, we don't talk to the White House. We don't take questions for information or anything like that. All of that is supposed to be filtered through the Department of Justice to put DOJ in a position of kind of playing traffic cop. However, on the national security side, as you know, Mike, we generate a lot of intelligence that's important to the national security professionals who make decisions about, federal policy. We are an active participant in the kind of coordination process that takes place. And you and I suffered through many, many meetings in this room together, torturous meetings, but that's a really important part of the national security process. So the FBI is not just allowed to, but expected to share intelligence from its national security investigations directly with the folks on the National Security Council. So it's important that the director and the deputy director of the FBI have very close and kind of positive relationships with the head of the National Security Council, directors for Homeland Security, and all those different positions, which I'm happy to say we had a really good run with that. As an FBI agent, you have to be able to kind of draw the line when it's one thing to share intelligence from a counterintelligence investigation, what you're finding. It's a different thing to say, okay, and here's what we're thinking about charging this person with, or investigative strategy going forward. So you're constantly, even though you can talk to the national security folks at the White House, it's supposed to be in the realm of sharing intelligence to alert them about possible threats. It is not supposed to be bringing them up to speed on what we think about a particular case and how we're going to resolve it.
And just very quickly, is the same true of your relationship with Congress in terms of not talking about a case, but talking about the national security information you're developing?
That's correct. So it's important that we're responsive to requests from Congress, particularly from the intel committees. And we generally shared intelligence and kept them apprised of things. Anytime there was a terrorist attack, we would quickly get on the phone with the leaders of the intelligence committees and let them know what we knew. I mean, technically, is that sharing information from what could end up being a criminal case? Yes, but it's also intelligence about this was an attack. Do we think another attack's coming? Are there other people out there that we need to be worried about? That sort of stuff. We, again, draw the line at are we going to arrest the guy? If so, when? What's he going to be charged with? So it's a bit of a balancing act. but it absolutely has to be done. The Bureau won't be able to live up to that intelligence role that we all found after 9/11 is something we need to do to help protect the country. You would not be able to do that without kind of interacting with the community, which includes the White House and Congress on that level.
So we have a couple of questions about the recruitment process, and in an age of, in addition to COVID, we've obviously been having a national conversation about racial justice. So it's a kind of a two-parter, if you would. One is the FBI, do you think, committed to a more inclusive workforce, and are there sort of serious issues over time with the FBI not being quite as representative? This is a problem that's true for many institutions in the federal system. But secondly is the notion that the FBI is now being challenged to investigate some of the police, situations that have created so much friction this year. And how do you think that's a particularly delicate and challenging situation for FBI agents to go into a racially tense major American city and have to because the question of whether there's an FBI role in looking at some of these police investigations?
Sure. So on the recruiting front, you're absolutely right. It's been a problem in the Bureau as it is in other government institutions. We are exceedingly male and exceedingly white, and that is a problem long run for the health of the organization internally, but also for our effectiveness. And you have to be able to interact with, and ultimately what it all comes down to is building relationships of trust. If you're trying to get information from a witness or recruit someone to start talking, to become an informant, or to develop a relationship with another agency to open up lines of exchange of information, you have to be able to develop relationships of trust. And the FBI will be more effective at that when it's more diverse. It'll open doors that are currently, tough for us to get through. And we should look like the country that we protect and defend. And right now we don't. We spent a lot of time focused on that towards the end of Director Comey, last few years of Director Comey's tenure. And I would expect and hope that they're still emphasizing diversity recruitment in the Bureau. As far as going into kind of tense situations to investigate issues of potential police misconduct, it's work that we've actually done for many years. We have the authority to do what they call color of law investigations. So to come in and determine if constitutional violations have been committed by, people acting under lawful authority. I think typically we're able to do that well, because usually when we come into a situation, we're coming in as the outsiders, the objective investigators. We're not part of the police department that's being investigated, but maybe, not like part of the community that's usually calling for an investigation. So the community typically embraces the idea that the FBI is there to kind of shed some light on issues and concerns that they have. So I think we've had some success in doing that in the past. It's a little more, honestly, it's a little more uncomfortable between the Bureau and the police entity that's being investigated. But that's never stopped us, right? We do legions of corruption investigations, color of law investigations, and we don't worry about who's going to become offended by that. And eventually, people move on. So it all kind of fixes itself with time, I guess. I think that it's really important for the Justice Department to do that work. So not just the FBI, but for DOJ to remain committed to going into communities and figuring out whether or not police departments have been exploiting the community in different ways. The DOJ does that through what they call pattern and practice investigations. Those investigations came essentially to a halt under Attorney General Sessions. And I believe strongly that that's work that the department should get more actively engaged in.
Thank you.
So Ellen, I'll let you wrap this up in a second here. I just wanted to take a moment to mention two people in the audience. One is General Michael Hayden, who spent the hour with us, and It's great to have you, General. And I gave General Hayden a little shout out this morning on Twitter for something he did that I was extraordinarily impressed by, and also wanted to recognize Ron Marks, former intelligence officer who is joining the faculty at George Mason as well.
Thank you, Michael. You saw more names than I did, so that's terrific. General Hayden, so pleased that you're with us. And so on behalf of, I think, both the Michael Hayden Center and the Center for Security Policy Studies, I think we can bring this conversation to a close, but my goodness, there's so many wonderful issues to pursue. I see the Dean is still with us, so I don't know if he'd like to also say a word of closure, but thanks for the very provocative questions that we saw from the participants, and really a command performance by Andrew McCabe, telling us, giving us really some deep insights and rich exposure to life in the FBI and the complicated but quite important role that the FBI plays in our domestic life and in our national security. So, Dean Rozelle, would you like to say a final word?
I thank you both, Ellen and Michael, for leading this program, and especially Andrew McCabe for this wonderful discussion. We're proud to have you in the Schar School teaching with us and doing these types of virtual programs, and look forward to doing programs in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. So this is just one of the most fun parts of my job. I just have to say I absolutely enjoy just listening to these programs, and it's just great. I get to do a nice little introduction, sometimes a little closing, and then I just get to sit back and listen and learn things. So thank you for educating me today, and I look forward to future programs with the Center for Security Policy Studies and the Hayden Center. And let me thank all the 175 or so participants who came in today to listen to this program during your workday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Dean Rozelle. Thanks, Ellen and Mike. It was really, really fun. And I'm so enthusiastic and appreciative of being part of the Schar School. So thank you.